Accommodations and Modifications for Students with Hearing Loss. Hello, I'm Heather Hall, the Kentucky School for the Deaf Outreach Consultant for the Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative area. Deaf and hard of hearing students. Deaf and hard of hearing students have unique educational needs due to the fact that they do not have the same ability to learn by simply listening to what's going on around them. Their hearing loss can and often does impact all the instruction that uses language as a base, which is in every single lesson that's taught in school. In our area, all teachers of the deaf and hard of hearing are itinerant teachers. They travel throughout the district or even multiple districts to provide resources and assistance to students that are deaf and hard of hearing. This leaves the bulk of the education of students that are deaf and hard of hearing on the general educator or even other special educators in the building. So keep this in mind that you, more than a deaf and hard of hearing teacher, are responsible for the educational services provided to these students. Responsibility for educating deaf and hard of hearing students. Because most districts have itinerant teachers of the deaf and hard of hearing, the child spends most of their day without them. This means that the general educators provide the bulk of instruction for these students, and general educators are usually the primary teachers for these students. So the responsibility for their education falls generally on that general educator. I can't sign. What am I supposed to do now? Some general educators can feel overwhelmed when they get a student with a hearing loss in their classroom because these students are relatively rare in any school setting. General educators can feel that they can't effectively communicate with these students to take the role of the primary teacher. But with good accommodations and modifications and help to ensure that the child has access to education, this can be done. It must also be noted that most colleges don't adequately prepare teachers to work with students that have hearing losses in the general classroom or the significant language delays that can be associated with it. So this may lead to teachers feeling that they're not equipped. But with the right supports, you can also provide those services. Some may feel that if I can't talk to the kid, how am I supposed to teach him or her? Again, the IEP will help define what is needed to ensure this communication is correct and will allow the student to have the access to the education in that general teacher's classroom. Myths about hearing loss. Hearing aids do not fix a hearing loss. It's a common misconception that people have. Also, they think that if there is a sign language interpreter there, that language problems don't exist in school. Again, this is not true. The deaf or hard of hearing student is not just the teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing student. It is multiple people that are responsible for ensuring that they get the instruction that they need to be successful. I have a deaf and hard of hearing kid. What do I do now? First, don't panic. They're not aliens. They're really just students with some special needs. And you should be open to the suggestions of the teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing in your area, or if you don't have one, the Kentucky School for the Deaf Outreach Consultant will be more than happy to come in and help you with these students and their needs because they're very familiar with the types of things that these kids have to have. And don't see them as a new problem to deal with, but as a new frontier to explore. Teaching these kids can expand your toolkit of things to help all students learn. So they're actually going to give you an opportunity to increase your skills. Ask questions and for help. That's what the deaf and hard of hearing teachers are there. They're there to help you help their students. And arm yourself with the knowledge about the student and their needs. Once again, it will help you help them. How can I help my student during instruction? Students with hearing losses need some special accommodations and modifications to have access to the instruction. So, arming yourself with this knowledge is going to help you. Using these accommodations and modifications to help your student learn in the general classroom will increase their access to instructions and improve outcomes. Remember, don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it from the experts. Defining the different types of adaptations. There is a difference in the types of adaptations, such as accommodations and modifications, that are used in the classroom. So we're going to start off by defining what each of those are and what they entail. Accommodations. Accommodations focus on how the student accesses and demonstrates their learning. Accommodations don't significantly change the instructional level of the content, or even how they demonstrate their learning. The changes are actually there to provide equal access to learning and equal opportunity to demonstrate what they know. An example of an accommodation is, say the standard is the student reads effectively to understand a variety of materials. The appropriate accommodations that can be included to help with this are things like preferential seating, acoustical treatment of the room so that noise is not reverberating, our use of an interpreter to explain the instructions for the reading assessment. Extended time limits are allowed because they take longer time to process, and allowing students to sign their responses to the interpreter to let you know they've learned the content you've presented. Modifications. Modifications are different. They substantially change what the students are expected to learn and how they are to demonstrate it. These changes are made to help students participate meaningfully and successfully in learning. Examples of modifications for the standard of the student reads effectively to understand a variety of material might allow the student to read a passage at a much lower grade level or use an interpreter to sign the entire reading passage to the student. The content is significantly modified to help the child learn the content. We're going to look at some adaptations in the general ed classroom. Now that we've discussed what your role is and defined the different adaptations you use, you have to keep in mind that you have to match the adaptation to the student. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Evaluate each adaptation to see if it is effective for that individualized student. Match what works for the student to what you can change in the classroom. Environmental. You want to make sure that you seat the student in the best place to allow them to attend and participate in classrooms. This is different for different kids, but keep in mind that you need to also make sure they're not seated beside a source of noise like the pencil sharpener or the heating and air conditioning unit or even a doorway where noises frequently come in. Makes it hard for them to listen and can be a source of distraction. You may also want to give the student a swivel chair on casters. This will allow the student to turn and move so that they can see what's going on and be able to figure out who's talking. It's a great accommodation for kids who need that extra mobility. Arranging the seating in a semicircular pattern also is great for kids with hearing loss. It gives them a chance to see who's speaking and be able to turn if necessary so they can attend to the speaker. The acoustics in a classroom can have a big impact on students with hearing losses. If you can reduce the noise and reverberation in the classroom, it makes it easier for them to listen. You can do this with carpeting, drapery, acoustic tile ceiling, or even acoustical wall treatments. These are all great ways to keep the background noise from becoming too much. You can also use flashing lights to signal that there's time for changing of classes or even from rotating from one station to another in the classroom. Ringing bells may not be the most effective way to do this. Also, remember that safety alarms such as fire and tornado should also have a flashing light component. This allows students with hearing losses to be informed about what's going on around them. Input. Students that are deaf and hard of hearing, these are the following things that you may use to help them have access to what's going on. The use of a radio frequency transmission unit, better known as an FM system. This allows the student to hear the teacher no matter where they're at in the room as if they were standing within 3 feet of them. It's great to help them have the chance to hear more clearly what is being said. Stand where the student can see your face. This is important. Students with hearing loss can rely heavily on facial expressions to help them figure out what's being said, so make sure they can see your face when you're giving them instructions or directions. Make sure you face the student when you're talking. They can't see your lips and they can't read your facial expressions if your back's turned towards them. Another great tip is to use an overhead projector or a smart board to display whatever notes that you're giving or whatever topic you're discussing so they can visually see what's being discussed and said. Also, if the student qualifies for an educational interpreter, they need that to have access to what's going on in the room. The educational interpreter will sign what's being instructed during that time and will facilitate questions from the student back to the teacher or from the teacher to the student in the language that allows the child to have complete access. If you can team teach with a teacher of a deaf and hard of hearing student, this will also be a great help to the student. Team teaching can be team teaching or it can be collaborating. Whenever those two individuals work together to ensure that the child has access to the instruction going around them, the better off for that student. Also, if you're covering new grounds and new vocabulary and concepts, pre-teaching those to the student with a deaf and hard of hearing will allow them to have some foundational understanding of what the instruction's about. It's very important. Remember, kids with hearing loss have limited vocabulary. And you also may need to modify the class schedule to reduce fatigue. It takes a lot of energy to pay attention and watch all day long. Students who are deaf or hard of hearing usually become very fatigued by the end of the day because it takes so much energy to pay attention and follow along. And if you could provide a study guide with the key concepts, vocabulary, questions, and facts that you're going to cover, this also helps them figure out which direction the instruction is going and those key things that they're going to take away. It's a very helpful tool, not only for students who are deaf and hard of hearing, but students in general. It is also helpful to provide a copy of the teacher's notes. It's very difficult to copy notes, pay attention to the teacher, and look at the paper at the same time. This gives the kids the chance not to miss any important information provided. Highlight keywords or concepts in any printed material that you pass out. Sometimes our kids can get stuck on trying to go through the words and figure out what every word is. But if they know what to focus on, it's much better. Supplement lessons with visual materials. If you can use real objects or pictures, charts, videos, anything that gives that information in the more visual mode, usually is very helpful for our students. Graphic organizers are also great because it allows them to pull out the important key information needed and those supporting details. They're great to help for the kid from getting stuck with so much words. Providing manipulatives for multi-sensory hands-on instruction is great too. Let our kids show you through their work what they do, not just depending on the language skills to show their progress. Use of peer tutoring is great too. Students really respond well, especially the older they get, to working with their peers rather than having an adult standing over them. And A use of a note taker. If you have a student in the classroom who's really good at taking notes, allow those notes to be copied and given to the student with a hearing loss. It's a great way to make sure they got the information everybody else got. And if you can work in groups like cooperative learning experiences, those are great for the kids. Just make sure the noise level isn't too loud so the kid can't filter out background noise from what they need to hear. Learning centers are nice too, very distinct places to go to work on individual skills. This also helps a student with deaf and hard of hearing focus on key concepts. And remember, if you can use games to practice and drill students, it makes it much more fun, much more engaging. And use concise statements or simplified vocabulary if the kid is struggling with whatever concept you're giving. Break it down into the basic things they need to know and use vocabulary that they understand. Once they have that basic understanding of the vocabulary, then they can start adding new information to it and expanding their knowledge on it. The use of a buddy system where another student restates the direction or helps a student who's deaf or hard of hearing stay on task is great. That's a natural cue from their peers to know what is appropriate and inappropriate. But you don't want them doing the work for the kid, just helping redirect them or keeping them on task. Cue students visually to indicate that someone is talking during a class discussion or during intercom messages. Remember, they have a great deal of difficulty hearing when they can't figure out where the noise is coming from, and intercom messages can be very garbled. Repeat information that has been expressed by a person out of view or delivered over that intercom. So you're going to make sure they caught what was being said. For example, it would be like, yep, John in the back, he said he had this opinion about whatever topic they're talking about. So the kid knows where it's coming from. And if you could write short summaries of the lesson or the chapters of a textbook that a kid's going to use, again, that gives them a heads up to what's coming and prepares them for the learning experience. You can use a peer tutor, paraprofessional, or volunteer to review the work and important concepts and vocabulary and facts with the students. That's repetition, which is really important for our kids. They need to be exposed multiple times to concepts and vocabularies in order to learn them. Sometimes you can find commercial software that will provide practice for a child on new vocabulary or concepts, so it allows them to review that material over and over again more independently. And if you play a YouTube clip or movie or television program, make sure you have closed captioning. Closed captioning is what our kids need to have access to what's being said. Many times there's talking off screen or more than one person talking at a time. And if I'm trying to figure out who's saying what, then I'm probably going to miss important details. So please use captioning on all your. We discussed previously that students fatigue really easily. They also get frustrated. So if you can divide and organize lengthy directions into multiple steps, that helps our students chunk them and be able to do them step by step by step instead of trying to feel overwhelmed about everything that was said at once. Demonstrate directions to clarify what needs to be undertaken. If you can visually demonstrate this or walk them through that process for a few times, then it becomes something they're familiar with as a routine and can do it independently. Check for understanding by having the student restate the directions. You want to avoid yes or no questions because it's easy to shake your head yes, even if you didn't understand what was said, rather than to admit that you didn't catch it. Kids are really big on doing this sometimes. Break long-range projects into short-term assignments. If I have short goals to reach, then I feel more successful and it makes me easier for me to finish that process. This is great for our kids with hearing losses. Post the date on the board when assignments and projects are due and remind them frequently. Having that visual representation of knowing what's coming helps them keep up and not fall behind. Increase the number of practice examples of a rule, a concept, or strategy prior to assigning seat work or homework. Remember, they need lots and lots of practice when it comes to learning. and this will help them be more successful in your classroom. Once again, remember, if you can shorten the length of assignments and provide additional opportunities for practice, that's going to assist your students with hearing losses be more successful in the classroom. Kids with hearing losses also tend to have some organizational skill problems. And so you may need to specifically teach organizational skills to assist the student in figuring out what they need to do and how to keep everything in order so they don't miss assignments and they don't fail to turn things in. Teach students reading comprehension strategies as well. These are skills that are not easily understood by kids with hearing loss due to their language difficulties. So if you can give them tools to figure things out, they're going to be much more successful. Provide duplicate sets of materials for families to use and review. Sometimes our kids need to go home and have even more additional practice at home. Don't overwhelm them, but at least to keep the parents in the loop to figure out maybe things that they can do at home to help reinforce those new concepts they've learned. And have a student summarize at the end of the lesson to tell you back what they've learned. This gives you a good gauge on how well they understood what was going on and how they're internalizing that concept. And if you can use a thematic theme that will stretch across a curriculum to tie a bunch of things together, that's even better for the kids. And they also see that a concept can go to different categories in different ways. Output. Now we're going to look at what the kid does to help them tell you what they've learned. Kids with hearing loss take a longer time to process things, so you may need to allow more time to complete assignments. And allow students to make models, play, develop skits, or create art projects to demonstrate their understanding of the information. Sometimes they struggle so much with the words and the language that they don't clearly state everything they've learned. If they can model that, then you may get a better understanding of how well they understood the concepts. Allow written or drawn responses to serve as alternate to oral presentations. Sometimes our students are very reluctant to speak in class because of their hearing loss, or it may present difficulties simply from their speech patterns. Allow a student to use a computer or word processor. These are ways that they can easily type out what they like rather than trying to struggle with writing everything out. Use cooperative learning experiences to develop a cooperative small group projects. When they work with their peers, working together, not having to do all the work on their own, this allows them to develop those skills for working together as well as being successful in showing what they've learned. Use peer tutors, paraprofessionals, or volunteers to work with the student on a task if they need the extra assistance. Peer tutors are great because they're their peers and it's not an adult hovering over them. Social. This may not be an area you think of, but social interactions may be difficult sometimes for students with hearing loss because they don't clearly understand what's being said around them, or they may not have the same communication mode as most of their people around them. So teach hearing students to sign. It's a great way for those peers to have one-on-one conversations without having to have an adult facilitate them. If the student uses the oral approach, teach hearing students how to position themselves so that they can see their face and understand what's being said. It also gives them tips on how to interact with their peers. Make books about hearing loss or deafness available in the classroom so the students can research and learn on their own. Invite deaf or hard of hearing adults to come to the school and share stories. A lot of times our students don't see deaf or hard of hearing role models around them, and it's great not only for the hearing students, but for the student with a hearing loss as well. Implement a Circle of Friends program so that you have intentional working on having students interact with everybody so that they can do the work they need. Structure activities and experiences for deaf and hard of hearing students to work together. That peer support is great, and working with a kid like you also bolsters the kid's social skills. Teach units on social topics so that they have a better idea of how to interact with those around them, and provide direct instruction on specific social skills if there's a difficulty with any one. They have to know how to approach those in order to successfully blend in with their peers. Behavioral. Provide consistent expectations and consequences with regard to classroom rules and routines. Make sure that you are consistent in keeping those the same so the student is not surprised by sudden changes. Place general rules and behavior expectations on charts and display them in the room or on a sheet of paper that's on the student's desk. Remember, keep them posted and visual. This is going to help to guide the students knowing of which behaviors are acceptable and not acceptable. Use an interest inventory to identify positive and negative reinforcers for each individual. If you can figure out what the student likes, then you can set up goals to work towards earning those. Use assignment books or folders to increase organizational and memory skills. Sometimes these students have really big problems with keeping organized. So if they have one place where everything is put and all assignments are written down, it'll help keep them organized and on task. And also provide regular feedback and check for the progress often. They need a lot of checking to make sure they're following whatever instructions being given. Home and school contracts. These are contracts that are set up between the school and home. They help define the students' specific behaviors that need to be demonstrated or followed. It keeps both the home and the school on the same page and is a great reinforcer that carries over from school back to home. Send a daily or weekly report card home on how the student's behavior is. Highlight the positives as much as possible. Use corrective feedback. And you would word this in such a way that it would be like, I would like you to take out your book and read when you finish your work, rather than bothering the person sitting next to you. So you're going to give them a behavior that's substituted to anything that's disruptive. Increase the frequency of descriptive phrases. So you want to reward them when they've done what? Well in the class. For example, you really paid attention and stayed in your seat for 15 minutes. It's very good work. This positive feedback will increase those behaviors. Evaluations. You can use a peer tutor or paraprofessional or volunteer to work with the student to review for test. Remember, our students need lots and lots of practice and repetition in order to learn things. Also allow test times to be assigned to the students and the student to respond in sign if that's their main mode of communication. Allow tests to be taken with a teacher or paraprofessional who works with the students who are deaf or hard of hearing. This will increase the direct communication between the two and may give you a better result of what that child has learned. Provide extra time to complete test and quiz. It takes these students longer time to process language and therefore they may need the extended time. If for some kids, allowing the test items to be read to them may be an accommodation that's needed, since they may struggle very much with trying to read things that are presented to them. And you can also modify vocabulary used in tests to match what the student already knows. This is just a way so that the concepts are connected and they understand better what was taught to them. You also may want to shorten the number of test items. Remember, fatigue and long time to process things may be helped if they have fewer number to take. No, that's not all. I presented only a few adaptations that may be used for the deaf and hard of hearing students, but there are many more out there. The key is to see what works for your student, and it may take you some time to switch and try different ones to figure it out. But don't be afraid to ask for help or suggestions if you get stuck. Especially ask the student what works best for them. And share the wealth. If you found something that helps the students, make sure the other teachers and other people that work with them have that information. It's a wonderful way to ensure our students have access to what they need.